Read with me Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10 to begin. Now when he concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. And a certain centurion's servant, who was dear to him, was sick and ready to die. So when he heard about Jesus, he sent elders of the Jews to him, pleading with him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they begged him earnestly, saying that the one for whom he should do this was deserving, for he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue. Then Jesus went with them, and when he was already not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof. Therefore I did not even think myself worthy to come to you, but say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I also am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and turned around and said to the crowd that followed him, I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel. And those who were sent, returning to the house, found the servant well, who had been sick. Let me introduce briefly Capernaum to you. So probably all familiar with the Sea of Galilee. One clue of the influence of Rome, which as we're reading here about a centurion, that would have been a Roman centurion, is that not only was this body of water known as the Sea of Galilee, it was also known as Lake Tiberias. And that's even mentioned in John chapter 6 and verse 1. And so there's some evidence there. Of course, Tiberius, I believe, was a Roman emperor. In 2007, I was able to go on a trip with some other Christians and visit some of the places mentioned in the Bible, and was able to visit Capernaum. Here's one of the places where these are homes in this town. This was a fishing village. Peter and Andrew were from Capernaum, and I believe near one of these residences, a fisherman's hook was found. It was a fishing village. And of course, that was the work of Peter and his brother before they began following Jesus. Another place that is commonly visited in Capernaum is a synagogue there. And there's two layers to it. This white rock that you're seeing was a synagogue from the 5th century, but the bottom layer of rocks that you see is from the 1st century. And assuming Capernaum was not anything like the size of Jerusalem, so I would assume there was only one synagogue in Capernaum. If there was, then this bottom layer is the foundation of the synagogue that this centurion helped to fund the construction of. And so people can go and visit that still today. But it was here in Capernaum, that Jesus says he found great faith. And so that's what we're going to look at this morning, going back through the text. I won't read every verse again. But Jesus found great faith in Capernaum, the statement that he made here. I don't think he makes the same statement anywhere else at any other time, at least that is recorded. And so let's consider the great faith that Jesus found in Capernaum. As we noted, that there was a centurion. Luke tells us that he sent elders of the Jews to him. As I mentioned, if you want to flip back and compare as we go through, you can. I don't think there's really any other passage. I may reference a few, but we probably won't even be turning and reading any other verses this morning. And so if you want to go back and forth and compare, you can do that. Here, a centurion, a Roman centurion. Do you remember in Acts chapter 10, Cornelius is another centurion, someone who was powerful in the things of this world. As this centurion says, he was a man of authority. And so here, someone with a Gentile, a Roman background, sends and has this request for Jesus. I want to notice, though, Matthew and Luke report this in different ways. Matthew says that a centurion came to Jesus. Luke tells us that the centurion sent elders of the Jews to him. Matthew doesn't say anything about them. So this might be a good place to think about for a moment, ask the question, because many people are not just asking the question, they're making the assertion. Well, see, the Bible contradicts itself, because Matthew says that the centurion came to Jesus. Luke says that he himself didn't go, but that he sent out the elders of the Jews to him. So does the Bible contradict? Is Matthew telling us something completely different and contradictory to what Luke tells us? Let me give another example. In John chapter 19 and verse 1, we read that Pilate scourged Jesus. And I believe that's also the wording of Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well. As Jesus stood there and as Pilate's trying to negotiate and be a good politician with the people because he saw through their empty accusations. And so you remember one of the things he tried to do to satisfy them was to scourge Jesus. And so the text says that Pilate scourged Jesus. Who held the whip? Did Pilate pick up the whip and scourge Jesus? Or were there soldiers who were trained? Did Pilate send soldiers, assign soldiers? In fact, that was, again, some Romans soldiers, they were trained in that. They were skilled in that. Scourging was not the task of a Roman governor, of a Roman politician. That was not the kind of thing that they did. Pilate scourged Jesus by the messengers, by the soldiers to whom he gave that assignment. It was not based upon their authority that Jesus was scourged. It was Pilate's authority. That's what it means that Pilate scourged Jesus. And so likewise, when Luke tells us that Cornelius sent messengers to him, it is through the messengers that the centurion came to Jesus. He sent the message to them. It was based on his authority that they came. And so this is not contradictory or extraordinary or unusual or strange. This is the nature of authority. And the fact is we all talk in ways like this. And so no, Matthew and Luke are not contradicting each other. They're giving the same facts. They're telling us what happened. The centurion, through his messengers, came to Jesus. And so from time to time, if you talk to people about the Bible, there will be people who will tell you, well, no, I don't read the Bible. I don't bother with all that. Don't you know the Bible contradicts itself? You can't trust the Bible. It's been translated so many times that the meaning has been lost. We don't even know. And how do we know we have all the original books? They'll give all kinds of reasons. So I wanted to use this example to remind you, when you hear that, when someone claims that, whether they're asking a question or making a statement, then challenge them patiently with all long-suffering and doctrine, but tell them to give you an example. When they say the Bible contradicts itself, make them give you an example. When I had two Mormon guests in my home one time, and they made the statement, the Bible contradicts itself. So I asked them for an example, and they gave an example. It wasn't this one, but they gave an example, and it failed. It failed the test. It was not a contradiction. And many times there will be people they're repeating what they've heard. They're telling you what they've been told, and they haven't taken the time, I would say the majority of the time, they haven't taken the time to look at the claim, to find an example. They've just heard, or they've heard someone else describe an alleged contradiction. And when you look into the facts, when you look at all the information that's provided, no, the Bible does not contradict itself in this passage or in any other. And so a centurion sent these messengers and came to Jesus. The centurion pled with him through his messengers, and even those who were sent pled with Jesus to help. The servant is described by Luke as being sick and ready to die. Matthew says that he was paralyzed and dreadfully tormented. And so here the centurion has the servant. He cares deeply about him enough that he was willing and desiring to go out and find help, and knowing who to ask, he pled with him. Now, how would a Roman centurion, how would a Gentile know to seek for help from Jesus. We might assume a word would spread among the Jews. But back in Matthew chapter 4, Jesus had already been working in the area of Capernaum and among some of the other villages throughout Galilee. Matthew 4, verse 23 says Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in the synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. So sometimes we often think about Jesus working in Jerusalem and the villages around that, and he did. But of course, another good portion of Jesus' work was done in Galilee. And this is just a subtle reminder that not only did the Jews hear about it, but even Gentiles, the Romans, heard about this. And word would have been spreading, and it did spread enough that here was someone who not only believed, but was desperate and expressed that in the message that was sent to Jesus. Look at Matthew chapter 11 and verse 23. Here, the centurion believes deeply. It's not just as though he heard about something and, okay, well, I believe that happened. He believed it deeply. But here's something that's ironic. In Matthew 11 and verse 23, Jesus speaking in reference to many of the cities of Galilee. Remember, he had gone throughout Galilee. And he addresses Bethsaida and Tyre and Sidon. And in verse 23, he says, "And you, Capernaum, who are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day." Here, before Jesus even does anything to help the centurion, we see how great his faith is. And he accepted it, and his faith grew when he received what he requested. But here in this place, the majority of the Jews, I don't know if it included these who were sent, but the majority of the Jews, and whatever the population of Capernaum did, whatever the population was, did not accept the things that Jesus was saying and doing. But at the least there were a few, for as Luke tells us, he sent elders of the Jews to him, and they also pled, not just on behalf of the servant, of the centurion and what he said, but they even added their own reasons, that Jesus, he deserves this help, he loves our nation, and he has built us a synagogue. Again, probably a portion of which you can still see to this day. So Luke tells us in chapter 7, verses 6 through 8, that Jesus agreed. And so as he goes along the way, and as he was already not far from the house, then there comes another party from the centurion. Now he sends out a group of his friends who meets Jesus not far from his home. And through them he says, well, Jesus, you don't even need to come under my roof. And he even then goes on to explain why he did not come in person. And he says, I am not worthy. I did not even think myself worthy to come to you. So the centurion understands the concept of humility. Here, a powerful man. I don't know how Jews or Gentiles or others would have viewed a centurion, but probably typically, like younger people especially do today, oh, there goes a centurion. Wow, look at his shiny shield or his sword or his spear. Here's someone who, at least for the Romans, would have had the respect of the people. The Jews, maybe not typically, but in this case, even he had the respect of many of the Jews, even the elders of the Jews. And yet, despite the high esteem that he probably had in the eyes of many people, he views himself as not even being worthy to in person come and approach Jesus. That doesn't mean that everyone who came to Jesus asking for help or asking for a favor was not humble. There was more than one way to express humility. And so if you can think of maybe the rich young ruler, he came to Jesus and he said, "Good teacher," and then he asked him an important question. Others came and the woman just touched the hem of his garment. And so people could express their humility in a variety of ways. But here's how this Gentile expresses his humility to Jesus. But the way that he says this is worth some reflection for ourselves. He says, I didn't even think myself worthy to come to you. He obviously didn't even really think that he was worthy to make a request like this. He didn't make the request because he thought he deserved it or could earn it or deserved it at all. But he cared for his servant enough, and he knew enough about Jesus to make this kind of a request. But the way that he chose to show his humility was by sending messengers. Like the centurion, the same is true of you and me. And how do we get this across in our own mind? And how do we express humility to God? There's more than one way to do that, but the way that he said it is worth us thinking about of ourselves as well. Because when we worship God, Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 through 22 describe our worshiping God. Sometimes the phrase draw near is an expression of someone coming to God to worship God. And in the Hebrews, it describes us drawing near to God as though we're going into the holy place, a place that only the high priest could go. But as priests, we have the high priest. And he says, well, here, I'll open the veil. You can come into the throne room. You can come before the God of gods and the King of kings, and you can bow down and worship him. And so whether we do so publicly, when we do so publicly, and when we worship God privately, it's worth from time to time thinking, or including in our prayers, again, public or private, thinking that I come because Jesus gives me permission to come, but I'm not worthy to sing a song about the banner of the cross. I'm not worthy to offer a prayer to God. I'm not worthy to eat with Jesus. Remember, Jesus said, I'll eat with you in my Father's kingdom, in reference to what we did a few minutes ago in memory of his death. To share a meal with Jesus. I'm not worthy to do that. You're not worthy to do that. We're not any more worthy to offer anything to God and for God to pay us any attention. We did not earn some pass into the throne room. Genuine humility puts us in the right frame of mind publicly and privately when we worship God. And when we have that kind of humility before God, then that helps and certainly affects and defines our relationships with every person whom we meet every day. When we recognize who we are in comparison to God, then we recognize who we are in comparison to everybody who we know that we'll see, and we enjoy seeing them or we kind of dread seeing them. The people who help us and the people who undermine us, the people who encourage us and the people who frustrate us. We're no better and we're no worse. We are their equals. They are our equals. That defines our relationship with them when we have our relationship with God properly defined in our mind. And so that's one reason that this centurion, he could find another servant. He could probably go out and just pick someone. But here he cared for his servant. And part of that is because of the humility that was in him as he considered who God was, and in this case, who Jesus was. And so he sends the elders of the Jews, he sends this other committee out and expresses this humility to Jesus. And then in Luke, at the end of verse 7, and then continuing into verse 8, there's something else that he understood. He understood how small he was. And then he also understands the authority that Jesus has, and we see that in the description that he gives, maybe summarized best by this statement when he says, you just say the word. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed. He understood what we sometimes call the chain of command. And he starts that by saying, I am a man under authority. So we think of the centurion being the man in authority, and he was, but he begins by saying, I understand. I'm a soldier. There are people over me, and so I've got to obey them. and certainly a soldier understands that and is taught to understand that whether or not they want to, whether or not they like to, whether or not they fully understand why to, whether or not they fully agree with what they're told to do, what do they do, Roger? And what do they do out at Eielson, Darrell? They do it. It doesn't matter. You're told to do it, as we sing. So it's even true in the military. You trust and you obey. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe even if you don't trust, doesn't matter, you obey. And so he understood that. That was his work. That was his livelihood. And then he goes on to say that he understood that as well, that he had soldiers under his authority. And so he says, as it were, if I snap my fingers, then it happens. I say go, I say come, I say do it, then they do it. As he told Jesus, just say the word. And that was how he phrased it. I just say the word. I just have to say one word. And think about the authority in one word from someone who's in authority. When someone who is in authority says, go, that's a very specific instruction, isn't it? It's specific in regards to what you are expected to do. You are expected to go. But there's a lot more said as well. That's specific about what to do, but it's general about where to go and how fast to go. Doesn't matter. You just better be in the process of going. And it can also be general about when you return. And in some ways, maybe it's the tone of voice and the expressions that go along with it, because depending on when it's said and how it's said, go might also mean, and do not come back, or at least do not come back soon. If you were told to go and you step outside the door and then you step right back in and say, hey, well, I went, not going to go well. Well, you didn't tell me how long to be gone. Well, it was implied, it was understood, and it will not be well with you. And so he understood that. In receiving those kinds of orders, he understood about giving those kinds of orders. And so he says, Lord, I say the word, and it gets done. And so I know you don't even need to come under the roof of my house. You don't even need to see me. But just say the word. Think about what that says. Here was a busy man. But think about how much thought and attention he had obviously given to who Jesus was, what he had heard that Jesus had done, and the power that was not only within Jesus, but then the power that would go from Jesus only by words coming across his lips. This is a simple concept, but this is neglected by many, many people today. There are many people who understand the idea, the statement that Jesus has all authority. But then how that translates into his authority coming through what he has said, and then what that means for us, is much neglected today. Men still need to be asking the question. The centurion didn't ask a question, but this needs to be understood. When he says the word, then we need to understand what that means. People today need to be asking, well, did God say the word? And there's applications of that to human government, because there are some general things that God has said, and there are some specific things that God has said that apply to human government. Now, maybe we wish God would have chosen a specific form of government, and that every government ought to follow that form of government. And if they don't, then we don't have to obey them. But he didn't. God didn't say much, but for example, in passages like Romans 13, there is a standard, there is a law that God holds human governments accountable to. And some of what is said in Romans 13 is general, and some of what is said is specific. And so human leaders, whether on a national basis or a more local basis, need to ask the question, well, did God say the word? And that should direct their decisions. This is true in families. Husbands and wives and every part of a family needs to stop and ask, well, did God say the word? And based on what he said, then there needs to be the right kind of response, because God also said some general things, and God has said some specific things that relate to the family. God has said who may marry, and God has said who may divorce, and God has said who may not marry or marry again. God has said who should lead, and God has said who should follow, and God has in some general ways, in some specific ways, given the role of each member of the family. Every part has a place because he created every part. He is the one who connects every relationship, and he has told every part what to do. And so every family member needs to ask, well, did God say the word? Every sinner needs to ask, well, what did God say about the problem of sin? And God has said some general things about faith. And God has said some general things about repentance and confession and baptism, water baptism. And God has said some specific things about all of those and how they relate to the forgiveness that he offers to all men and to every creature. But it all goes back to the Word. What is the Word that is said? And then sinners who ask that question and then respond to it the way that this centurion responded to what Jesus said or would, Christians then have to have the same mindset that he did. Well, Lord, just say the word. And whatever you say that is general and whatever you say that is specific, then I'm going to consider that, and I'm going to understand that, and I'm going to do it. And while the New Testament is not as prolific, as detailed as the Old Testament, and how many specific things have to be done in such and such a way, there are plenty of general and specific things that relate to the thoughts that we choose to dwell on and the attitudes that we choose to persist in and our priorities and our words and our money. Jesus talked a lot about all of those things. And there's plenty that is general and plenty that is specific about what we are to put off and what we are to put on and what we are to accept and reject and to flee and to pursue. There's plenty there for us to think on and to reflect on, to ask the question, or to say with the affirmation that the centurion did, say the word. And he has. And that's true of the churches as well. Of course, our society has a lot of traditions when they hear and think about the word church or churches. But a church, a local church, is Christians who are joined to one another. A church is not just Christians who happen to live within a 10-mile radius of each other or who can walk together and meet within an hour. A local church is Christians who have committed to working together. I've been asked before, well, what about the idea of church membership? Is that even in the Bible? And the concept is, the word may not be, you don't have to use the word membership, but membership means we belong to each other. We've made a commitment to each other. In Acts chapter 9, like Saul did when he came to Jerusalem, he desired to be among them, but for the time being, he said, no, we don't trust you. And then over time, they listened to each other and worked through that together. And then they were members of one another in the sense of they belonged to each other because they were committed to one another. And so there's some things that Jesus has said to Christians that apply to our individual hearts and lives and decisions. And then there's some other things that relate to Christians working together. God has said some general things and some specific things about who oversees one church. Well, Jesus does, and that's what Church of Christ means. It means Christ is the head of the church. And then, kind of like the centurion, he has sent some under his authority to do some work. And he said some general and some specific things about their work, what they made, and that guides them in what they may do and may not do. Elders, the overseers of a local church, are not life coaches in the sense that they don't have the authority to dictate and to define every decision that every member of that congregation would make. Their authority is limited in many ways. Likewise, what the church may use its parts. It may involve its parts in, each member, I mean. Now, the church can't make a decision about what every individual member will do in their job and with their money. There's limitations to the decisions that a church makes together about its parts, its resources, its money, even its assemblies. Maybe this is just automatic to us, I don't know, but it shouldn't be. We need to understand it. Our assemblies, we have to have authority for our assemblies. Do we have authority? Did Jesus say the word or any word that would say that the Chena Small Tracts, Church of Christ, could assemble to make a decision about whether we are all going to vote or all not going to vote in some local or medial or federal election? We don't have authority to gather together and make that kind of a decision. You may feel strongly about whether you should or shouldn't, and you can. And we don't have to agree on that. And that's not a church kind of decision. Our assemblies are not for the purpose of coming together to decide, well, how are we going to bring justice to our society? We're going to correct every wrong. We don't gather to talk about that. That's not our responsibility. And neither do we gather to, well, how are we going to teach our young people how to build a fire or how to build a house or how to build their athletic abilities? That's good for some parents to do who want to do that. But our assembly, we don't have authority. Jesus didn't say the word about the church assembling to oversee those kinds of trainings and activities. So that's why I say that this is a concept. The title maybe is understood, the authority of Jesus, but what he has said and what that means and what he has not said and what that means is not well understood today, is not spoken of often enough. But knowing the statement that Jesus made about the faith of the centurion, this man has great faith. Well, what was part of his great faith? Part of it was an understanding not only that Jesus had authority, but how the words of Jesus applied to him and to anyone. This centurion knew that the weakened body of his servant would respond if Jesus said the word. But he also knew if Jesus didn't say the word, then nothing would happen. In other words, the silence of Jesus would be respected. Now, of course, there wasn't any choice in that regarding the disease, but just to emphasize the point, we need to ask the question, did Jesus say the word? If he didn't say the word, then we need to consider that. We need the faith of this centurion, and part of that included an understanding of who has authority, what authority is, and the role of words in understanding the authority. So much that was communicated by what this centurion said in Luke 7, verses 6 through 8. And this is an interesting statement. Rare, I think the only time. He marveled at him. Who marveled at who? Well, usually it's man marveling at Jesus. But that's not the case here, is it? Jesus marveled at the centurion. And as far as I could find, this is the only time Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John say that Jesus, in a positive way, marveled at man. I think there might be one or two other occasions where he marveled for the wrong reasons. This is worth our attention then if Jesus marveled. Now, of course, it's not that Jesus was surprised, but this was rare. And it's not that this was impossible, clearly, but it was rare. When you think about everything that we've talked about of the centurion's confidence and his understanding, and Jesus says, I have not found such great faith, no, not even in Israel. Who again, Jesus is in the hometown of Peter and Andrew. I don't recall if all of Jesus' disciples are with him at this time. But if any of the 12 are with him, then what Jesus says something about them. And you had these elders of the Jews who were sent by the centurion. And Jesus says, I have not found such great faith, no, not even in Israel. It's a backhanded slap of sorts, a wake-up call for that purpose to them. But unless I misunderstand the statement, Jesus said in all of Israel. His mother was a faithful woman. But Jesus says, I have not found such great faith in Israel. Jesus said of John the Baptist, of all the prophets, of all born among women, there's not one greater than he. And John is still living at this point, if I have it right in the chronology. And Jesus says, I have not found such great faith, no, not in Israel. Something he never said about anyone else. Maybe equal faith was seen later, I don't know. But at least to this point, Jesus' greatest compliments were given to people who were the least thought of. I don't think he said this, as I've said, about anyone else. In regards to a Canaanite woman in Mark chapter 14, verses 8 and 9, Jesus made a similar statement. And then the only other example I could think of that would approach this was the woman who anointed his body in the house of Simon the leper in John chapter 12, when they said, "Oh, this money, this ointment was just wasted; it could have been sold." And Jesus said, "No, leave her alone. She's done what she could, and the whole world is going to know about what she did." Who did Jesus give the greatest compliments to? A Roman centurion, a Canaanite woman, and a Jewish woman. So I wonder, this made me ask, so does God ever marvel when he looks at this world? He sees the faithless, he sees the total rebellion, and then he sees those of faith. Does God ever see faith like this, that is not just faith, but even among those who are his, that he would say have great faith? I can't absolutely answer that question. If Jesus were on earth today and traveling today as he did then, who might he say, "Oh, there are these who have great faith"? If he did, who would it be? Would it be elders, preachers, deacons, others who are in the public eye? Might. But it would be someone like the centurion, someone who recognizes how small they are. Not someone who is so interested in everybody seeing me and where I am and what I'm doing, but someone who realizes I'm small in the sight of God, and at best, in one sense, I am the equals of everyone around me, but certainly not better. Someone who has that mind, and then who's willing to express it, but not as a means of a show. Not that that's their Facebook post. That wasn't the reason that he said what he did. But someone who confesses that to God, and they're not ashamed to say something like that publicly, though not for attention. And then who, with full confidence, asks some great things of God, some significant things of God, but especially not for themselves. That's a summary of what the centurion did. This was a big request. The man was tormented, ready to die. And so this centurion thinks about how he's going to approach Jesus, how he's going to do that. He makes this great request with full confidence on behalf of someone else. If there are people today of this kind of faith, then how rare is it? And does God marvel at it? I don't know. But that's the kind of faith that I want to have, that I want God to see in me and whomever I could influence. So Jesus marvels at him, and then Jesus talks about his great faith. And then Jesus uses a phrase that we're probably pretty familiar with if we've read through the Gospels at different times. And I say to you. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record Jesus using that phrase at different times. I say to you, and only Matthew records this, and over in Matthew chapter 8, if you want to flip over and see, but he says that many will come from the east and the west and sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom. So, of course, when Jesus says kingdom, Jewish ears are going to perk up, aren't they? Oh, yeah, the kingdom. We want the kingdom. We want Jesus to bring the kingdom. But what kingdom was Jesus talking about when he says that some would sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? There is the kingdom, and Jesus had been preaching the kingdom that was soon to come, the kingdom that Jesus said, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God present with power. So that kingdom was not present at this point, or when Jesus was preaching the gospel of the kingdom. This was the kingdom that Daniel prophesied of. But that's not the kingdom Jesus is talking about here. Their interest would have been, and their mind would have gone towards that kingdom, but that's not the kingdom he's talking about. He's talking about the kingdom that Peter also speaks of in 2 Peter 1, verse 11. He calls it the everlasting kingdom. And he's speaking of one to which we can be received. And so he tells, again, I haven't found this kind of faith in Israel, but he isn't going to be the only one, Jesus points out. There will be many in the kingdom who sit right alongside Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Again, for brevity's sake, we don't get all the thoughts often of the people who are listening, but I suppose that got the attention after he'd already said what he did about this man's faith. But then there are going to be many, and doesn't emphasize of the Jews, but many who are not the sons of the kingdom, and they'll sit with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the next thing he says is, over in Matthew's account only, that the sons of the kingdom, many sons of the kingdom, see if I'm getting the word right, maybe not many. Okay, the sons of the kingdom will be cast out into outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So here's one way we know the kingdom he was talking about is the eternal kingdom, is heaven, because then he talks about outer darkness. And he says the sons of the kingdom will be there. There will be weeping. There will be sorrow. Maybe that's even pain. And there will be gnashing of teeth. That's anger. Have you ever thought about that those in hell, of course there will be sorrow, but there will at least be some who will be angry that they are in hell. And Jesus says those will be the sons of the kingdom. Now that kingdom is the present kingdom, the current kingdom at that time. He's talking about the Jews. But of course, let us not forget, there will be sons of the present kingdom today. How shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? Hebrews 2, verse 3. And so in application, what Jesus says, we can take it personally in that sense, that there will be sons of the kingdom who will also be cast into outer darkness. Who says so? I say to you. And then maybe his eyes go back. Remember, he wasn't far from the house. I don't know if those in the house could hear or not, but he maybe turns back that direction. And the man who was paralyzed, dreadfully tormented, sick and ready to die, recovered that hour. And if you think, well, why that hour? Why not that minute? Why not that second? Because they didn't count time in minutes and seconds. They counted time. They measured the day just by hours. They weren't the micromanagers that we are. Got to be top of the hour. They didn't do that. I think that was done in maybe the 14 or 1600s. But that hour, it means, that minute, it means immediately. As he said, as you have believed, so let it be done for you. So do you believe this really happened? You really believe this happened? Or would you say, well, it might have happened, but we can't really know for sure? There would be some who would say, this didn't happen. This is legend. This is myth. This is some inflation. There was a good man who was named Jesus, but that's about all that we really know. But whoever they are, whatever they would say, what do you say? Did this happen? How sure are you that this happened? Because that's one reason, and among maybe the many reasons that this is given, not just to be an interesting story, but this, along everything else, is presented, and then you have to make a decision about this. If you choose not to believe it, then what you're saying is this is a book of lies. There isn't any middle ground. If this did not actually happen, if this did not really happen, then throw everything out with it. Throw out Genesis, throw out the Proverbs, throw everything out. It's a book of lies, and how are you going to distinguish what the truth is and what a lie is? So if you don't believe this really happened, then what good is anything else that's here? But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name. And then having that life and continuing in that life means paying attention not just to the interesting or amazing things that Jesus did, but then, of course, the purpose of that was to draw our attention to what Jesus has said. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. The centurion had heard something, and so he responded with this great faith, and the more that he heard, the more that he believed. The song that we sang a few minutes ago, Lord, I believe, builds that case. Well, here's what I know, and Lord, I believe, and then I've learned this, and Lord, I believe, and therefore I know this, and Lord, I believe. That's a part of great faith and growing faith. It's great to read a chapter a day. I don't know what your habits are, your routine is in regards to reading the Bible on your own. Some people, I'm going to read a chapter a day, or I've got a plan. I'm going to read all through the whole Bible in a year, or 6 months, or 2 years. And read by yourself, or read with your spouse, read with your children. How you sort all that out is up to you. But let this also be a reminder, it doesn't have to be a chapter. Sometimes it could be 10 verses, let's say, that would help to set your mind on things above, that would set your mind in a variety of areas. Think of all the different topics that we just touched on this morning, that would set your mind back on where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. And when your mind is put back into that place, I hope I've done that, if nothing else. As we sing number 310, Christ is at the right hand of God, but He's not going to stay there. He is going to come back. He's going to come back in the clouds. And the dead in Christ will rise, and those who are living will meet Him in the clouds and will forever be with the Lord. If that were to happen today, do you expect to go with Him? Do you expect to return with Him and be at the feet of the Father? Answer that question as we sing this song. Reflect on, we know what the centurion asked for. What do you need to ask God for today? And if you need to receive the blessings of Christ, if you know that you're separated from God because of your sin, then if you'll have the faith as a mustard seed, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, if you'll confess that faith, if you'll be baptized into Christ, you'll be baptized into His death, and you'll be forgiven. If you need to ask for God's help as a Christian, either repenting of your sin or just His strength, we all need His help. Think about what you need to ask God's help for, and if we can help you in some way, come forward as we sing.